IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
कृपया ध्यान दीजिए, the language used on the podcast may not be fit for consumption. We warn you, tread carefully. But listen yaar, don't be so conservative. Okay, Cyrus says from the glistening fountain area, South Mumbai, where the money used to be, it's all gone to BKC. We've got a very interesting guest today, the word I use every time, Manu S. Pillai. He'll come on in a second. I'll talk all about him. The whole show is dedicated to him. Manu, with a lot of respect. But you have to hang in there for 30 seconds while I rant about this huge problem. I've spoken about it before. Indian men in urinals take too long to wash and wash too much. So I actually timed this guy in the studio the other day because after peeing, he went into the basin and then he washed everything from head to elbows. I mean like elbows and everything else. And I put it on stopwatch. It was 53 seconds. 53 seconds. Then I timed myself 1.5 seconds because frankly speaking, you need to use the two fingers that hold the extended organ. And I use extended loosely. All right. You really don't need more than that. If you're very gifted, maybe 3, but that's it. But he cleaned everything. And this happens all the time. They clean their face, their eyes, their nose, their ears, and their arms up to their elbows. It's always up to the elbows. It's not fingers. 53 seconds of my life stolen by that man. But I'll rant about it later because I can't waste Manu's time. He's a very important man. He's won many big awards, some of which I can't pronounce. That's how big they are.
If you're a cricket fan, check out Edges and Sledges, India's favorite cricket podcast.
The podcast focuses on Indian cricket, the IPL, and has a ton of banter both on and off the field.
We talk about the week's biggest cricket stories with current and ex-international cricketers, coaches, or sometimes just between us.
And it's hosted by me, DJ.
Me, Varun.
And me, Ashwin.
New episodes release every week.
You can catch us on the IVM Podcast's website, app,
or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast.
Let's bring in Manu S. Pillai, author and historian. Quickly to tell everybody, hi Manu. You're looking, I must say, resplendent.
Hi, how are you, Cyrus?
Lovely to see all the books.
Oh, well, really? I just came out of my workout and I'm pretty sweaty, but anyway.
It's not the workout thingy, it's the books in the background. Those things my kids have never heard of, you know, these things with letters inside and all. I'm trying to preserve a few, so 50 years from now, people will say, book, what is that? You know, and then you take a look and show them. But you're all about it, so it makes a lot of sense. I must say, authors are getting younger and younger. Obviously, I'm getting older, theory, relativity, I guess. Yeah. When you were young and you're in school and stuff, you always think of authors as wise, old people. I can't think of any young author ever visiting us, or you think of the authors and you study them and research them. They're always old. Mark Twain is for forever 10,000 years old with like hair all over the place. And for example, just to name one, since I've not read that much. Manu, quickly, for those who, the 2 people who don't know you, we have 10 people listening. The Ivory Throne, 2015 was the first book. Then Rebel Sultans. Then The Courtesan, The Mahatma, and The Italian Brahmin. I dare say that sounds a controversial title. And now we're on False Allies. Which is the 4th book. So can we just quickly go into the life and times of Manu S. Pillai? How did you become a writer? And we'll talk about all 4 books if we can in the next, 10 minutes?
Yeah, largely by accident, because, nobody tells you when you're growing up that you can be a writer. I mean, usually, even after class 10, when I took up arts to study, my family, my extended family were like, oh, kids who don't do well in school go into arts. Why are you picking up arts? I had a very good science score, but I was very interested in that. But obviously, again, there was no question of, I was very interested in history as well, but there was no...
So once, let me get this right. You were good at science? Because what you said is absolutely true. My generation, I think I'm one before you. If you didn't do well, you went into arts. That was the only reason. Yeah. There was no other reason.
That's what my aunts and uncles said. And they thought secretly my parents were lying about my grades. But the fact was that I was not interested in science. And, I hated maths. I've actually scored... Maths I sucked at. Because I once scored, I think, half on 40 in a paper. And then they gave me 10 for attending the exam. And therefore it was...
0.5?
Yes, 0.5. It was that bad because I wrote one answer and then I left the exam hall. And
Are
then
you really Malayali? I thought you guys had matched from
no,
Nappy's
not
time.
all Malayalis. Not all Malayalis.
All my Malu pal, I don't think one of them is bad in maths. It's just not possible.
No, my mother was great in maths, but the thing is, I really sucked. And then I bunked my term end exam. So by the end of it, I had 11 marks on 150, which is when I ditched maths and then moved to history and said, look, I really can't do this, and took on history. And clearly,
Which is, ironically filled with maths. Well, at least dates.
Yeah, well, dates.
For that
Yes.
matter. Yeah.
Although, to be fair, writers like me try to make it less about the dates and more about the people and the fascinating stories and things like that, so that
I
more
think that's
people
one of the
read it.
mistakes our teachers have made, going from your point, is that they have made it too much of dates and sort of very dry in that sense.
Yeah.
Like 1789 Bastille or whatever. And then the whole Bastille is lost. You're only trying to remember the date of when it happened.
Yeah.
Maybe that was a mistake. Would you say?
That is a mistake. I think it sort of dulls history down into these like very, you don't connect with it. It's just these random things that happen at random times, and you forget that history was actually made by human beings. And it's always easy to connect to human beings rather than to date.
No, and also we're connecting the wrong thought process. We're thinking of the date, which is more important, when it's actually the philosophy, the social upheaval, the transformation, the event. It should be the other way around. Forget the damn date if you get it wrong also.
Yeah.
Which, of course, our present politicians get wrong all the time. Be it Alexander's entry to, who won the second battle of Panipat or third battle of Panipat for that matter. Anyway, coming back to this whole thing. So you want to be a writer, and this was against the grain. The family was not very keen, obviously.
No, my parents actually never stood in the way. The extended family was very taken aback. Parents never stood in the way. They were in that sense old-fashioned parents, which is that bache ho gaye, now you grow up.
They wash their hands off you.
We will feed you, dress you, that kind of thing. But they were not actively involved in, oh my God, you must be a doctor, you must be an engineer. My parents, that was good actually. My parents gave my sister and me room to just become who we wanted to become. And that was useful. And then I didn't think I would be a writer. It's just that I came across a fascinating story at the age of 18, this historical figure who's the protagonist of my first book. And I thought, gosh, this is an amazing story. And as most people in 2008 who were in their teens did, I had a blog that 5 people read, and I wrote a little article about this character. And then suddenly,
so our podcast, you mirrored that completely, spot on. Even the figures are correct. Irony again about the dates. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, and then the thing is, this was pre-trolling and all of that. Internet was still pretty benign and nice. People used to send each other funny forwards. That was the era. And then strangely for this article, I got a lot of flack, like random people commenting on my 10-person blog, saying that, how dare you write this? This is not true and all of that. And I realized, hold on, if a random kid sitting in Pune does a blog post on this historical character.
Are you going to say bloody Pune?
Yes, I almost said
please
that.
Do. Come on, this podcast is in a place where you can be a little free. You put you on television and surgically remove everything.
No, I've become far too free.
It's not a defacing Pune.
No, I've become far too free recently. I'm actually appearing on camera in a t-shirt, which I never used to do a year ago. The pandemic has changed far too many things. Anyway, so then I wrote this blog post, and then people attacked me, and I was like, at the age of 18, if you're told not to do something, you're going to do the exact opposite. So I decided to dig into the story. And then for 6 years, I worked on that book. And it was in parallel to my studies, to my first couple of jobs, all of that. And then the book came out. And I think the book did really well, which is when I realized, hold on, I could actually do this and make a living out of it and enjoy it. I don't need to have another career and then juggle a book project all the time side by side. I can just become a writer.
So question before we go to Ivory Throne, do you think the controversy is not a bad thing then in the end of the day? Because you look at, say, someone like Salman Rushdie, Midnight Children, probably my generation, of course, we were brought up on all this, so we have to know it. But I'm sure everyone will remember satanic verses in subsequent generations, but nothing else. Yeah. So in a sense, he remains immortalized.
Yes.
Across cultures and languages, I'm saying people will remember satanic verses because of the controversy. Yeah. So controversy is
naturally it bumps up sales. And people, it's banned in India, but it's as if it's really banned in India. It's very easy to find copies of that book in the age of the internet.
There's no such thing as banned in India. Do you want Daru in Gujarat? Come with me. Yes. It takes 2 minutes. Yeah. No, I was just asking.
Controversy helps to a certain extent, but then it can also backfire. That same first book also ended up getting me a defamation notice, and in your 20s getting a 5 crore defamation notice is not a very pleasant experience.
Arey, ego ki baat hai, 5 not bad, 5 crores for a 20-year-old, come on, not bad.
It was late 20s, but yes,
late 20s, still 20s. The poison chalice, fair enough. Let's quickly talk about the Ivory Throne then in a couple of lines. So this was a story that took you 6 years to bring to print.
Yeah, it was about this last female Maharaja of Travancore, and when women ruled in Travancore, they were not called Maharanis. When whoever sat on the throne was called a Raja. So these women were also Maharajas. And it was about these 2 sisters who were both Maharanis, except that one had the male heir, the other ruled till the male heir grew up, and their power politics. And the thing is, you hear a lot of historical figures who are men and their power politics, but to see a protagonist and an antagonist who are both women and who are sort of owning that power and sort of fighting it out in a darbar in the 1920s, while also governing well, while also doing black magic, while also doing all kinds of other things. It was a fascinating story. It just taught me that in India, beyond the nationalist struggle, beyond the usual narrative that we get, there are so many stories all over the place, and so many fascinating, rich characters who did such weird but interesting things, and you can connect with all of them because they were all human beings. They were not these historical figures in court sitting on a pedestal. They had all kinds of like affairs and all kinds of like things that we human beings do even today. There was nothing, Lord Curzon.
What's the point of being the Maharaja, quote Maharani, if you can't have affairs?
That's true.
I mean, really? Come on, for God's sake. That's fair.
No, and what was fascinating is how much the British kept records on all of this. Because you think the British Empire was about people
sitting... morality issues.
Yeah, and all of this. Because you would imagine everybody sits down at a table and everybody's very dignified. But no, knowledge is power. So you're constantly spying on the Rajas. Finding out where they're going, who they're sleeping with, what they're eating, all of this. Because that access to knowledge about these people gives you a degree of control over them.
The birth of the famous tabloid The Sun, one of the worst newspapers in the history of the English language, comes from the old collections of the East India Company, keeping an eye on our Rajas and Ranis.
That I don't know.
A dossier of bad behavior.
But the East India Company and the British were a huge vacuum sort of hoovering machine for gossip. All across India, the Viceroy would get fortnightly reports on all the gossip that was happening. And, ultimately knowledge is about what you're hearing, right? About what people are saying.
And we also forget, I think, that Kerala is a land of kings and queens, right up till almost independence and beyond. Somewhat forgotten sometimes because of the dominance of the North in politics and history and pushing out the agenda from 3-4 states and stuff like that. But you're right. So that's really fairly interesting that, we have all this political intrigue going on. But just to understand, so the two sisters hate each other. Who are the regions?
They were originally fond of each other, but the thing is, once they got married, once this whole race to produce an heir came into the picture, and once power came into the picture, that's what power does to everybody, right? You forget who your relatives are, and it becomes about possessing that object. And that, and at the end of it, one sister, the in quotes, the antagonist of the story, she triumphs, and the protagonist leaves the palace, leaves the state, and dies in obscurity 30 years later in Bangalore. And one gets a gun salute when she dies, the other is cremated in an electric crematorium. It's very much, if you've seen the Netflix show The Crown, it's a little bit like that very complicated relationship between sisters, where one is thrust into the limelight and the other resents it, and all of that follows.
And you'd think that it wouldn't be an all or nothing story if you're born into the into regality and all this, that you could still be the runner-up, so to speak. There's no need for you to land up in Bangalore in a pauper's grave, etc. I mean, that's terrible. That it's like double jeopardy. You go from 100 to 0.
No, the thing is, she was harassed quite intensely. Like no control over your own household, no control over who your staff are, no control on who manages your affairs, which means you're constantly watched. You feel like you're actually, so from the outside world, you're sitting in a palace and you're very privileged, but inside, every person employed in your palace is a potential spy. You can't speak freely in your own house because you don't know who's reporting back to the other system.
But is that actually there? Or is that like paranoia that happens to the person, or is actually filled with spies?
No, there's actual evidence on this. And there's, again, because the British kept such strong records, exact times, exact periods when her palace was taken away from her control, new managers were appointed, she wasn't allowed to stay where she wanted to stay, allowances were stopped in case she didn't listen to what the other palace was saying. The conflict is, and the thing is, it really tells you about how power operates even today. It can get very petty. Even people who on the face of it would seem very secure and powerful can sometimes have these very petty ego clashes, because human beings are human beings. And that's why I said, if you look through history and just trace all the human beings, you can connect with history far better, because they're just like us. They may live in different times and contexts, but ultimately we're made of the same bundle of contradictions.
A sad commentary on the British. They'll end up in the famous phrase of, "I'll tell your father about you, man," which is what really happens. It's so sad. It's a list of blackmailing sort of files that they've kept, which now, as you mentioned, it seems to be the most important thing in politics. Probably still there all over the world.
And of course, when they left India, they destroyed all the copies that were there in India, because they didn't want the Maharajas to be exploited or blackmailed by the Congress party after independence. But in London, all these secret files still exist. Therefore, you can still go to London.
So they could still pull the strings from there.
From there, if they wanted.
Yeah. Well, couldn't get the Manchester Test to be played. So obviously the files are lost as far as I'm concerned. But let's move on. Where we got 3 other books. Let's quickly go through 2 and then hit False Allies. So Rebel Sultans.
Yeah, that is a history of the Deccan Sultanates. Deccan is basically this whole Telangana, Maharashtra, Karnataka, that zone. And usually when people talk about it, it's either about the Marathas or the Mughals. And I grew up here in Pune. So, the thing is, we had these cameo appearances by the previous Islamic sultanates that were there. And I was like, why aren't we talking more about it? And the more I read about it, the more fascinating it was. And fascinating, colorful characters. Ibrahim Adil Shah II with red nail polish, Sunni Muslim, but calls himself son of Saraswati and Ganapati.
Really?
There's African. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've been to Ahmednagar.
Why do we have his statue up as a secularist?
No, and that's the thing. He was a contemporary of Akbar's, and he was very similar to Akbar, trying to sort of, engage in a lot of
unify the.
Yeah. In Ahmednagar, which is a sort of tier 2 town today, people don't know that there were black begums. There were at least 2 sultans who had black wives. That before Shivaji, decades before Shivaji, the person standing between the Mughals and the conquest of the Deccan was an African man called Malik Ambar. The Nizam
slave dynasty,
slaves. And he was an ex-slave, and then he became the warlord and a kingmaker. People don't talk about the fact that the Ahmednagar sultans were Brahmins who converted, but they became Shias. So they would send their bodies to be buried in Karbala in Iraq. It's the stories again are just utterly remarkable, just fascinating characters. Of course, lots of trauma and tragedy as well. When somebody kills his enemy, gets his flesh sort of removed from the body and cooked in biryani, and then like there's all kinds of rather violent things happening.
And consumed.
Well,
consumed.
The biryani is said to have been sent to the wife of the dead man, but hopefully nobody consumed it. So people could be very cruel.
But she knew that her husband's body parts are in the biryani.
The one hope.
But I know a few wives who would have eaten it happily. Damn you, Rajesh! At last, I got you where I want you. Ding. Okay, so that's a wide opening, and then we go through this. I'm very fascinated. I wish I had read. A good anchor would have read everything before calling you on. The courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin.
Yeah.
What the hell is that?
That's a collection of essays, actually. I'll tell you about the Italian Brahmin. Again, fascinating character. It was this Italian called Roberto de Nobili, who's from this Italian aristocratic family, became a Jesuit father and came to India to convert Indians to Christianity. He was not happy with the fact that the Portuguese, and this was all in the 17th century, he was not happy with the fact that the Portuguese were only converting fishermen and people on the coast. He wanted to really go into the interior and convert Brahmins. He wanted like the cream of Indian Hindu society. And when he gets there, he realizes that as long as I'm being seen as a foreigner, this isn't going to work. So he starts wearing saffron robes. He acquires a punul, or a sacred thread, like a Brahmin. He learns Sanskrit. He learns Tamil. He starts sitting on the floor and eating out of plantain leaves.
But he looks like an Italian.
He's white, but he completely becomes a sadhu in externally. And people treat him as a sadhu. When he goes into royal courts, they wash his feet. They seat him on leopard skin and tiger skin and things like that. And he becomes this Brahminized Italian who starts preaching the Bible as a lost Veda, and succeeds in converting lots of people to Christianity. Wow. Which is why even now a lot of Tamil Catholics, the fathers will wear saffron robes, they'll have tikas and so on, because that has continued.
So he localized the whole flavor, gave it a mix and match approach, which today, if you look at corporates who've done well in India, I'm going back to MTV early days. That was the whole approach. Localize. How do we localize? How do we entice people? Wow.
You're basically saying you can take our religion, but you don't need to change your culture. You don't need to change your clothes. You don't need to change what you eat. You can keep all of that right down to your Brahmin sacred thread, but you're Christians now. So,
he's not even changed it, because he's saying it's a lost Veda. So in a sense, it's an extension of your religion. I would buy it completely if he was a good speaker. People like me get converted left, right, and center. We have no idea where to go. Okay, so now let's.
So that book was a collection of essays on people like that, on courtesans.
But these are all true stories, right?
Yeah, they're all historical figures.
A couple of famous Italians, Niccolo Manucci and a couple of others. So they all went up north. So there were many of those who actually went down south as well and played an important role. Is it?
That's the thing. Most of the action did happen in the south, because the north is landlocked. The south is where the peninsula is, which is why lots of traders, lots of foreigners were drawn to. It was the south that they were drawn in such large numbers. A lot of colonialism began in the south. It wasn't. Bengal eventually was the big conquest, but much of it was originally happening in the south. Even for the Battle of Plassey in Bengal, where did the army come from? From Madras, to defeat the Nawab of Bengal. It's just that because power even today sits in Delhi, everything is a little sort of Delhi-oriented, everything is a little north-oriented, and we forget that the south had its own very interesting part. Italians also.
Yeah. I got a new title for you. The south has its own Italians. Sonia Gandhi to note. Manu S. Pillai's next book. Okay, let's get to the new one. So, False Allies. Is this a more contemporary sort of book?
No, The False Allies is about the princely states in India. It just came out a week ago. And it's about the fact that we think of Maharajas and all we think is, fancy palaces, luxurious silks, pearls, and people having a lot of wine and perhaps some orgies.
Never working.
And never working.
Yes.
But the fact is that, that's actually a caricature the British created. In reality, the Maharajas were actually pretty fascinating people. Mysore had, factories and ironworks, steelworks, one of the biggest dams in the world, gold mines, all of that. The Travancore Maharajas set up an educational infrastructure, which is why Kerala is still highest literacy in the country. And it's not a place where you can.
It goes back 300-400 years.
It goes back to royal control from the 19th century onwards, not all the way back, but from at least the 19th century. In the colonial period, the Rajas were not idiots. They realized that the British had certain cliches about them, and some of them actually countered those cliches quite successfully. Many of them were funding the Congress party. Your Dadabhai Nauroji, who won that election to the House of Commons in Parliament, his election was funded by a lot of Maharajas, because they had an incentive in sending an Indian into the Houses of Parliament in London and making a political statement. So they were not idiots, and they were not political creatures. They were also politicians. Just because they wore silks, we've sort of reduced them to what are, in quotes, effeminate scoundrels, as an Englishman said. But that was not the case.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, we do think of them as effete and doing nothing and charlatans and all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
How sad. You've changed my perspective already in just 2 minutes. I should have fought harder. Yeah. So what you're saying is we had quite a few visionaries who actually fought back, tried to change the kind of image that was portrayed about them, and also were good with their own people.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when we think of fought back, we generally think you have to get on the street and fight a mass agitation or a mass protest. That's the only way to do it. But the thing is, these guys were ruling 40% of the country, which was not under direct British control. The British tried to control them, but their governments were Indian governments ruling over Indians and trying to achieve things, and that states were seen as proper, legitimate political spaces. The British could not intervene in their states officially. Of course, they did, but there was always pushback for those things. And yes, many of the Maharajas delivered standards that were far higher than what the British could deliver in their own territories, because the British were ultimately foreigners, whereas the Maharajas still depended on their people. They still depended on keeping the loyalties of their people. And we assume that somehow the British are dealing with the Rajas and the Rajas are in full control. No, the Rajas have internal factions. They have internal balances of power that they have to maintain. So it's actually pretty political, everything that's happening. Raja is not sitting in a Darbar hall drinking wine and issuing arbitrary orders every 2 seconds. He's got, my grandmother grew up in a princely state, and in her state, for the first 10 years of her life, her father was a schoolmaster. They had lower caste teachers. The government used to supply not just benches and textbooks, but milk powder for the children. The government officials used to come and collect the taxes. It was not a local feudal lord or anything. There was a sophisticated government infrastructure that was already there. People were paid pensions. Everything was very organized. It was not some kind of backward feudal situation.
Manu, you've convinced me. Cancel democracy. Let's go back to monarchy. We've not given it a proper
No. That's not the argument of the book, by the way. No, but the book doesn't glorify them. There were bad eggs among them also. It's just that all I argue is that we shouldn't reduce them to stereotypes and caricature. What they achieved.
And one doesn't speak for all.
Yes,
but false allies, are we talking about perspective of Britain to India, or India to the Indian rulers to the Brits? Who are the false allies?
So the thing is, the British always framed the Maharajas either as idiots who they needed to control, or as allies and pillars of the British Empire. And the Maharajas also, on the face of it, said, oh yes, we are wonderful allies of the British Empire. But the moment the British back was turned, they would try to sort of, needle the British in their own ways. An example is, in the 1870s, there was this Raja in Indore. And he wrote this groveling letter about how India was a heap of stones, and then the Raj came and sort of built this wonderful edifice with its railways and the English language and all that. Now, if you read it on the face of it, you're like, oh my God, what a slavish, man. He's completely a loyal ally of the British. But look at the internal British correspondence, and he's actually described as one of the most disloyal princes in India, who presents the British with persistent opposition. That's their internal correspondence, which is that they also knew that what he's showing in public is not what his actual sentiments are and what he's doing behind the scenes. And a lot of Rajas did this. Lord Curzon found out that Maharaja of Baroda was happily sponsoring the Congress party, giving them regular funding and so on, because he wanted Congress to sort of add pressure on the British from the other side. And for the longest time, this is a thing. Till the 1930s, even the Congress and the Rajas were actually friends. Gandhi used to call the various rulers Rajarishi, compare their kingdoms to Ram Raja. The Maharani of Travancore was like Lakshmi. And he said, oh, her simplicity is even more, she's even more simple than I am. So Gandhi also respected the states for the longest time and the rulers of these.
So there's a lot of cunning there, again, which we don't attribute to our so-called lazy kings of the last 200 years. Cunning, intrigue, deceit, if you like, Machiavellian sort of thought, in justifying the means, playing the other person. So Oh, God, that's amazing. I have no idea that we had all this going for us.
And no, and the thing is, these guys also manipulated the British quite well. For example, you could bribe. So every court would have somebody called a British resident, like a British agent. Some Rajas and Ranis used to treat the agent like shit. So Maharani Baisabai of Gwalior, the British agent comes very hoity-toity, thinks he's going to be received as a VIP. She sends out nobody to receive him, makes no supplies for his kitchen. He ends up in a dark, cold house because nothing's been ready for him. And in her darbar, she treats him as a complete non-entity. British, in another state, they would often bribe these British residents. And just as the Rajas were watching, the British were watching the Rajas and who they were sleeping with, the Rajas could also watch who the British were sleeping with. So, in the 1920s, there was a
What if they slept with each other? That would be confusing.
Also happened, by the way. I'm not naming names, but also happened.
So whose file does that go into, Manu?
Nobody's file. That survives in oral history.
Oh, they complete coitus and they say, "Excuse me," and both pick up their papers, jot down a few notes.
No, but that's the thing. A lot of people kept private diaries. So even a British resident, he'll send an official report to the Viceroy, but the letter he'll send to his mother often has more details, more texture. And because the British are great at this, they've got these private papers in their archives. We also do, but we've usually got them for very well-known figures. In England, I found in the archives, even relatively obscure characters, you can donate your papers to. And if you even held a single decent political position, you can donate your papers. And my God, I found this resident's letters to his mother and so much like juice and gossip about what was happening in the court. And there was this one resident in Travancore in the 1920s whose name was Mr. Cotton. And there's a saying in Trivandrum to this day, which is in Malayalam, beddil cotton undo, which means, does your bed have cotton? Which on the face of it sounds like a cotton mattress. But the idea is that this man used to jump from bed to bed of the local women. And it's resulted in this local phrase. They used to have mistresses.
Wow, locally. He's immortalized in Malayalam for his sexual dalliances. Amazing. Yes. I mean, England should. This guy's statue should come up in both countries.
Yeah. And the Rajas watched them. They would find out if they had illegitimate children. They would offer jobs to some of them. They would bribe the residents. Some residents were taken aback. There was a Maharani of Indore who sent a fruit basket to a resident with gold coins concealed in it. And when he was like, "Oh my God, are you trying to bribe me? How dare you?" and all of that, she said, "What? You were expecting more? Is it just about wanting a little bit more? I can arrange that." So there was a lot of counter manipulation going on. Sometimes one wing of a royal family could use the British against another wing of the royal family. Sometimes the British could use internal dissensions in a princely state to create trouble for the Raja. And this goes down to politics. So you don't like a particular Raja, the British resident will ally with all the Darbaris and the politicians in the state who hate the Raja and sort of orchestrate a rebellion from below and then say, "Oh, look, Raja can't even control his own government. We must remove him and replace him with a new Raja." And Rajas would also, try and counter this in their own way. So it was not a case of these people being meek or passive. There was actually a lot of stuff happening. And small details like, people say, "Oh, they were so obsessed with small ritual and ceremony and these petty little things." But all of these had political meanings, So if a British resident came, depending on how the British relationship with the state had evolved, that where should the chair of the resident be kept in a darbar? Should it be next to the throne, which signifies equality? Should it be on the right side, which signifies respect? Or should it be on the left side, because the left is a little lower than the right? And then the British would argue, saying, "No, we must be on the right, or we must..."
Definitely in India right now. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's a good line. Yes. So, there's even small things have a lot of political meaning, which we don't always recognize on the face of it. In reality, little things like where a chair is kept may seem petty, but these were all loaded with political meanings. Sometimes at pujas in the palace, the British resident would insist that Queen Victoria's portrait must be kept on the nearest wall so that she's also present in token form over there.
But Manu, that's still there today. It's a little different, not so much about the chair, but where you're sitting next to whom, when the photos are taken, who's next to whom. They still do all that. And the attaches are always constantly fighting because the bow factor depends on these little things. And probably diplomatic relations get, I wouldn't say go askew, but definitely go up and down because of this.
Yeah.
So obviously nothing has changed. Listen, we'll run out of time, so I want to quickly get into some meaty stuff as well. People would know, but following your education, you worked with the Parliamentary Office of Shashi Tharoor. In New Delhi, and then also with Lord Karan Bilimoria in London. So if we could just get a couple of minutes on each. First, Shashi Tharoor, I'm a big fan, and also I think a lot of Indians are, even if they won't admit it in public in the present environment. But go ahead, tell us.
No, so the thing is, I had finished studying in London, and the thing is, in those days, what I wanted to work on was foreign policy. As I said, I didn't realize writing could be a career, and I could actually do history as a full-time thing. So I thought, okay, foreign policy or whatever. And I still remember I was heading back from London after my master's, and in the airport, I was boarding the Bombay flight, and I saw Dr. Tharoor boarding the Delhi flight, and I was like, hey, I know him. I'm going to write a letter and write an email and see if he has an internship to offer. So I came back, and a couple of days later, I sent an email, and he basically liked the email. I had nothing on my CV. I'd never worked. I'd never done an internship, nothing. But he liked the way I drafted my email. And he said, oh, you write well. Come see me in Trivandrum.
What did you say in the email? What would be the
nothing, just asking for an internship. But I think he's also a writer, right? So I think he just liked the way I structured the email.
You see, he just liked the style. There was the content wasn't really
content. There was no content. There was no content.
I thought you said, dear Shashi, love your hair, something like that. It leaves a mark immediately.
No. I was very honest about not having any experience, but simply wanting to work with him. So then I met him in Trivandrum, and he said, come, you can do an internship at my office. Luckily for me, a month later, the gentleman who was running that office left. And in those days, his office was just a clerical gentleman who had come from the government service, and the other chap. And once the other chap left, I got offered the role within a month. So I was bumped up a little bit. And then from there, I've sort of built the team. And now it's, I think, a 10-member team, if I'm not wrong, with interns. And there's a whole set of people there. And then there's a parliamentary office, there's a committee office, because he's head of various committees in Parliament. So that was fun.
Well, he's one Congress member of Parliament who continues to win and have a voice, while the rest of them are getting buried. I don't mean that in any other way. But tell us what is he like? Because I've done some events with him. I had the privilege of meeting him a few times as well. He's always fun with us, of course, but working maybe a different experience. And he's always very charming. And I think he's dynamite on stage. And I keep saying that the Congress missed a really big one when they didn't push him right to the higher echelons of power and maybe be the face of the Congress, because I felt that he had that pan-India presence, and he's just the kind of guy who has the magnetic personality that attracts people, and you have to have some of that. It's the same thing with Trump, whether you like him or not. I mean, that half the reason he was there is because he's Trump, before you get into what Trump is really about. Of course, terrible comparison. I'm sure he wouldn't like that.
I don't think.
I'm so sorry. Trying to praise a guy, this is what comes out. Yeah.
No, so the thing is, the charm, the speeches, and all of that is one thing. But frankly, what I really admire is his capacity to just work hard. The thing is, most people don't see that because they see the public sort of version where there's all of this happening, and he seems to do it with great ease. But when I was doing my first book, the 6 years that I was working on that's when I also began working for him. And one of the things, and I would sit in the office till late in the evening after everything was done and work from the office desk itself. And I remember I could see the light in his study in the house, which was opposite. That would be on to 2 in the night, 3 in the night. And I used to treat it as a kind of motivational thing because I was like, if he can do it after achieving so many things in life, then I at 21 have no excuse but to sit here and work. And he still does it. He just works a lot, like all the time. There's a lot of work in the car, in the evenings while he's eating. It's constantly just dealing with work and without complaining. I've never heard the man complain. I've never heard him get angry. I've never heard him be rude to anybody.
If he shouts at you, would it be in Malayalam or English? Like, would he?
But he's never shouted at me.
Really? Never loses his shape, as we say in cricket.
No, I've never seen it. Maybe, during the election, sometimes pressures go up, but that was small things, like people barging into his bedroom. The thing is, during an election campaign, your house is taken over by people, right? It's full of people, visitors coming, going, and you can't say no. It's just that when they barge into your bedroom, you draw a line and you're like, please, can I have my 2 hours of sleep? You can't just do that. Small things like that, maybe I've seen him lose his temper, but nothing never in any other sense. It's
how do you rate his Oxford speech, which of course broke the internet, etc., etc.?
I was actually there. I'm not in Oxford, but I was in Delhi, and I was part of that time when all of that happened, and it was great fun. I think we frankly, to be honest though, I don't think anybody expected it would go viral. It went I think the video came out quite some time after the speech, and it went viral after the speech was done, weeks after that. And so it took all of us first a little bit by surprise. And then, of course, it became a big deal and ended up in a book and all of that. None of it was planned. It sort of happened organically.
Also, I think one of the great points about him is that unlike, say, some of the anchors on news channels, etc., horrible, again, comparison, is that he makes his point with a lot of intensity and energy, but never loses his shape, like you said. He's not screaming ever or shouting ever. So there's a certain civility and decency to the presentation, which I think more sophisticated people immediately say, wow, now I want to listen to you. I was so used to theatrics and drama and melodrama and violence and aggression. And these are not qualities that are appealing to anybody who has half an education. So I do believe that there are far more Indians who actually like his style than people think. They really are, because whatever events I've done with him, he has been the star. I will not name other people there, but including actors. film
Yeah.
stars from Bollywood, etc. And he has been the star. They just love him. He went to Campion School, his old school, of course, and they wouldn't let him go. And the women thought of him as a sex symbol. They were crazy about him. He's
Yeah.
really, I really feel if I could just speak to the Congress High Command and just chat with them, Shashi Tharoor should be boosted up. And I think it'll make a big difference in 2023. Really, or 24, whenever it is. 24.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. Anyway, let's get a word on Karan Bilamoria. I always want to know because I think he's Parsi, but how does he have a name like Karan? Karan is a North Indian name.
You'd have to ask him. I think his parents, may have just chosen it. I think his father's name was Faridun Bilamoria. So
there you go. That's as Parsi as you can get. So Karan is a Kapoor-like name or a Khanna-like name.
Yes.
It's one of those names you get up north mostly.
Yes. I don't know the story behind Karan, but wonderful, wonderful man. I think there's that whole cliche, right?
But how did you land that job?
I was so the thing is I was doing my first book also as I was working with Dr. Tharoor. So I've worked with him in 3 different stints, by the way. So there were gaps between them. So after a while of working with him, I needed to go back to London to work in the archives over there for my book. I'd already had one round of work there. I needed another round. So I thought, okay, now I need to go work in London. So I got in touch with Karan and wrote him an email. And he was looking for a research assistant at that time. And for me, it was a foot in London. So I said, please, can I get this job? And we spoke on the phone and he hired me and I met him. There's that cliche, right? The Parsis are very decent and it's very difficult to find among Parsis a person who's not decent. And that cliche, I would suggest, is entirely true because he is the decentest person I know. And the word decent fits him perfectly. I have not seen a nasty bone. I've not seen pettiness. I've not seen anything. Ambition sometimes gives people a kind of negative thing as well. None of that. Very, very good to his
power and position corrupts people. Generally, you'd expect it from powerful people just tend to become more obnoxious. It just seems.
And he's very secure. He's very sort of, very in his element, very comfortable in his skin. And again, it was wonderful to work with somebody like that because frankly, I've never had a nasty boss. I've never in my life, and I've been self-employed for the last few years now.
Switch parties. I got a guy in UP. He's not known to be very friendly. Can I recommend him?
No, thank you. I think I'm done with that phase of my life. So I'm not going to work with him.
But that's really lucky. Both the gentlemen you mentioned seem to have, really, as you say, decent and civil amongst everything else, which is so rare. We've reached a point in the world history where, these 2 qualities are so rare. You find them, you say, wow, this guy is good. Last thing about Karan Bilamoria, so did you get to attend Parliament? I mean, not obviously.
You can go and watch and all that, but frankly, I didn't go much into Parliament because the frank truth is I was also doing my book, right? So I had a colleague who's very excited about Parliament, and I was more than happy to sort of let her take charge of that side of things because that would sort of free me up to do some of my own things. I was still working weekends, and we used to work over the phone. Every time he was driving, he'd call me, and then we'd do a bunch of things over the phone, and I didn't mind that. But as far as possible,
let me write that down. Lord Karan Bilamoria chatting on phone while driving.
No. You have that ear thing. No, he's not speaking.
Right,
he's not like us Indians in traffic where you hold the phone and then drive with the other hand
while talking to the cop. So excellent. Okay, listen, Manu, you've, as usual, spoken far too much. I was expecting to take a break 10 minutes earlier, but fascinating stories and very interesting. It's called False Allies. Go and purchase that book ASAP if you want to know more about the real history of India, especially from the point of view of Indian royals, which perhaps has not been told. And amazing, just as we go to break, amazing, I think, is that you did this hard work, what we call the legs of going to England, sorting out the archives to get possibly a more balanced perspective. Obviously, you did your research here as well. So, my God, it's too much hard work. And I would think that you become a writer because you can just sit on a desk and make things up. I mean, that's why I started writing. Just change the history. Isn't there a government somewhere in the world who does that? Just change it. Just make it up.
I mean, a lot of people are trying to do that. I wish I was into that, but unfortunately, I'm into the old-fashioned thing.
Oh, you're talking about those hybrid history dramas, is it? That have become...
No, I'm talking about generally how so much rubbish is peddled these days, and you just find a Wikipedia and you find some 3 other articles and you say that this is the truth, and it's so irritating.
Did you know we had airplanes? We had airplanes in Vedic times.
I've heard.
Yes, you must open your eyes, my friend. Open your eyes.
My eyes have been colonized clearly. That's why I can't see it.
All right. We don't have Lord Karan on the line, but we have someone who's also from royalty in Powai, Mumbai, who will join us just now as we take a break. It's so difficult to understand so many things in the tech world, not for Manu, but for me, like artificial intelligence. What is that? It just sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? And then I'm supposed to do my fake laugh, which I've now worked on all morning. and stare into camera like Norm Macdonald. Luckily, though, Intel's digital readiness program empowers everyone with skill sets, mindsets, and tool sets to use in an AI-fueled world, so you don't end up like me. This is my sacrifice. The Intel AI for Youth program is an initiative that guides today's youth to an understanding of AI, how it is designed, and why it's important today. Intel's been working with the CBSE, Ministry of Education, and the Government of India to empower today's youth to build social impact solutions while demystifying what AI is. How do you take advantage of this? Purchase an Intel Core-powered PC, and you can get free access to 80 plus hours of immersive and hands-on training about AI. This is something the moment the show ends, I'm going to do. On completion of the program, along with a certificate, you get access to AI tool sets to try to put what you learn to good use. So don't wait. Log on to Future Bana Wonderful by bringing home an Intel-powered PC today. Silvery, are you there?
Yeah, hi, Cyrus.
Hi.
Manu. Good morning. Hello.
Manu, what's your take on AI?
I don't know if I have a take on AI. I mean, if it makes research easier, great. Actually, there's now this. I think it's a new iPhone where if you sort of scan it over a newspaper, it sort of picks up the text. I wish I had that in 2011. All these What
do you mean? So I can just scan it and I can read on my phone?
Yeah, like it picks up just the text and like editable form. And I just saw it recently.
You can search with text also nowadays. Now, if you scan something. And that's something on like a piece of paper, you can scan it, you can scan the text, and then you can just search from that text without having to type. Yeah. You can also scan by images now. If you see an image that you like, you want to know what that image is of.
Yeah, that I know.
You can just search.
That I know. I'm not that much of a dinosaur. Yeah. I know that. I know about image search and all of that.
I know Cyrus didn't know that. I know Cyrus for sure did not know that.
Yeah. Every time you're in trouble, Sylvie, don't insult me to get out of it.
It's so easy.
I was just thinking, I hope AI comes up with something for dating where you can just sort of, cover the date a couple of times, swipe them left, right with the phone, and then you get all the information about what their preferences are so the date can end fast. I wonder if they could do that. Really, because we waste so much time in actual dating. Well, not me. I'm married now. I shouldn't be dating. But let's talk history. We're with Manu for another 20 minutes. Do we have AMAs?
Yes.
Hey everybody, it's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Longest Constitution, Priya narrates the long and ongoing battle of striking down Section 9 of the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955. That allows one party to appeal to the courts to restore his or her conjugal acts, and has unsurprisingly been used more by men than women. On Press Decode, Bhagda, Ragini, Sarah, and Adya talk about the inspiration behind the movie Hotel Rwanda. Venkatesh Saha, head of APAC and Middle East expansion at WISE, joins Anupam on Pesa to talk about foreign exchange services. And on the Life Manifesto, Zarina explains the difference between personality and personal brand. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. It really does help us. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quota, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and Intel vPro. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Follow me at Instagram and Twitter on Bored Brocha. I'm so bored, I need your help. I need your love. I need your touch. Okay, just follow me.
The first one comes in from Tarun Kaushik. He says, Manu, love your podcast with Amit Verma. Without making it political, how do you think history helps students in the longer run? And do you think the NCERT needs to amend its history syllabus?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I keep saying this. I have no faith about school textbooks and all of that, because you basically tell these textbook writers that you have 50 pages and you have to compress Indian history into 50 pages. Obviously, you're going to get a terrible job done because it's not possible to do that. I think the better thing is that once you're older, you read books that people like me write. I've got 4. Please buy all. And that may give you a better sense of things, or at least a better argument and a more interesting take on history. And the rest was what? Without making it political, how does history help students in the long run? Well, the thing is, history tells you why the world is what it is at present. And, if you can't make sense of what the world is at the current moment, then you can't necessarily also define what you want it to be in the future. There's plenty of evidence in history of people making political decisions that are wrong, but because humans can always count on their own stupidity, we'll keep repeating those mistakes. Whereas history can perhaps alert us that, hold on, you're making a mistake again. It won't stop idiots from making mistakes, but history can sort of shed some light on these things. Ultimately, the present is built on history. The shape of the country, why our politics is the way it is, why our institutions are the way it is, why the police reforms are not happening, why the judiciary is the way it is. All of this has justifications and explanations in history. And I think that's why you need to study history. It'll give you a sense of why we are as a people.
Yeah, but Manu and Tarun, I would say be careful about the phrase amend its history syllabus. While we accept that going through dates and making it bland and boring was the wrong way to go, that's a whole different argument. The worry is changing history, which not just our country, but a few countries, we just can't do that. You have to give the devil its due. If you don't like one side or the other, the truth is this happened. The Holocaust happened. You can't say they never happened, which, you know, you have a few morons across the world who just insist it never happened. And in our case, I'm a little scared about how they're just reinterpreting Mughal era history. I don't know how bad it is with the southern states, but you know, with the localized government coming to power and saying, I'd like to change this. This is what happened in the battle, and this is what I mean, that's a bit scary.
That is scary.
I mean, really.
And the thing is that's scary because it may not impact us right now, but if this is being fed to kids from the age of say 7, 8 onwards, by the time they grow up, you don't know what they'll think. You know, they'll have all kinds of weird ideas about the past. And I got flack recently. You know, I did this article on the Mapla Muslims of Kerala, and I gave this example of an old legend in which a sage called Vararuchi has a son who's a Muslim. He's got several sons. One is a Brahmin, one is a carpenter, one is a Muslim. And I cited this as evidence of how, you know, Muslims were sort of welcomed into local society and made part of the narrative there in Kerala. And somebody, a BJP politician on Facebook the other day, put up a post saying, as per my calculations, Vararuchi lived in the 4th century or the 5th century. Islam was only created in the 7th century. So you're lying when you say that. How is it possible? The chronology is all wrong. Firstly, I didn't write the legend. You know, I'm only interpreting what the legend is saying. The legend's been there for ages. But the number of people who've been tagging me on social media as if you've been exposed, your credibility.
But here's the rub. So he's upset because one of the kids is Muslim. So hence he goes into all that. If you just mentioned they were Jain, Sardar and Parsi, wouldn't bother him at all, and he would just gone on with his life.
Yeah, he would have gone on with his life.
There's pettiness in that. Yeah.
There's pettiness, but the thing is, he doesn't understand that. Firstly, I didn't do the legend. I didn't invent the story. The character's already in the legend. The other thing is, legends are not chronological. You know, legends are not about that. Legends are communicating something completely different. Legends are not accurate footnoted history with like your page numbers and references and files. Legends serve a completely different purpose. But you know, by framing it the way he did, by using this whole chronological argument, this is how fake news is created, right? It creates the impression of scientific credibility, even though actually trained historians know that what you're saying is dumb and it's not really true and it's rubbish. But a lot of people buy it, and you know, it's part of the business. I work with history. A lot of people are going to call me names, and that's part of the job.
Yeah, this emotive thing is also irritating, I think, after some time, where the emotional reaction, which is fueled by whoever, and then you have a whole lobby that emotionally reacts, as in the case of Satanic Verses or whatever, you know, where they're not really involved in what the real specifics are. There's no research done. There's no question of actually knowing what you're talking about. It's like, you tell my father, I'm going to fight with you. I mean, that's just, you know, I think those kind of people should be just sent out of the country. It's just, here's your passport, go and find another country.
But they want to send people like me out of the country.
I know. Don't worry, we'll keep you here. We fight. Manu, we draw the line in the sand. We fight now. We say enough is enough. There's nothing. Who says that they have the book on patriotism just because they decide to interpret history in the way they do? No, that's it. We make Shashi Tharoor the next Prime Minister of India. Lord Karan Billa comes in and makes the cabinet, and it's like a sort of vice position. And Manu, you yourself can be education minister. Silvery, you can be women and child development because you've got a very humane side to you. Me, I'll tour the world. It's been done before.
Manu, what do you think? What do you think about? So a lot of cities are having their names changed. Do you think doing that affects the way we remember the city's history? Maybe.
I mean, Kerala itself, the way we grew up with the Trivandrums and Cochin. Of course, Kochi, I mean, it's not that far away. Well, how important is it to Malayalify it? You know, is that a need?
I mean, the thing is, there's a very logical argument to keep both, frankly. You know, like I say Paris in English, but people in France say Paris. Correct. Now, the thing is, they will, when they come to London, they'll say Paris. Like, they don't have to say Paris. You know, both are possible. Even now, people use Trivandrum. A lot of this is obviously political.
So you're saying when you speak in Malayalam, it'll flow better to say the original word?
Thiruvananthapuram is fine for me in Malayalam, but Trivandrum when I say English. Bombay in English, Mumbai when I'm speaking, say in Hindi or Marathi or whatever.
I've been saying the same thing, actually. That really makes...
Yeah, why does it matter this much? But of course, I think this is part of a lot of what we call cultural assertion, which is that, look, anglicized names must go. So many years have passed since independence. In fact, there's people who now say India as a word is also not preferable. We should be using Bharat as opposed to India. But, you know, these are, I think, at some level, not very urgent debates. You know, these things will keep happening for different reasons. Of course, in some places, they'll keep changing names. I'm not entirely against it if people feel that it somehow reflects their personality and their culture or whatever. But the thing is, it becomes a danda with which to then start targeting certain people and not others.
It's the aggression related to it more than the actual changing of the name. As you said, from a practical point of view, absolutely spot on. What's the problem? No problem. Whatever the dialect is, the language flows. Mumbai, Bombay, and Bombay in Hindi, they all have their own way of, it just flows by anyone who speaks those languages. But anyway,
like Hyderabad, some people want to name it Bhagyanagar now, but the thing is, Hyderabad was founded by a Muslim king. He gave it that name. You want to have a Bhagyanagar, go invent a new city if you like. No, why do you want to keep reclaiming somebody else's legacy? That's a bit.
Respect Alexander the Great. He just named everything after himself. He didn't waste time. Okay, we won. It's Alexander or Alexandria. Just keep walking. Next place.
Also, in the middle, there was this whole thing where people would get offended if you said Bombay instead of Mumbai, right? People were like, how can you say Bombay, you colonial, whatever.
People didn't get offended. Politicians made people, instead
of exactly.
jobs,
exactly what I mean.
Infrastructure being looked at in education and health and all, you have louts on the road with nothing to do saying Mumbai ka sign chahiye, Mumbai sign chahiye, that Bombay nahi hai. That kind of thing.
Like people have to change the shop names and all, you remember? Like there was a whole thing.
But those kind of bullies don't belong in any society. They're just louts. It's just ridiculous that we just even have this conversation, honestly. What a waste of time. You come to PA and you change names and build statues. Come on, really? That's the reason you're in PA. 5-year-old kid will do better than that, won't he? You give a 5-year-old kid PA and say, at least build a sweet shop or something, which is of some service to somebody. Anyway, next question.
All right, next one comes in from Girish Patil. He says, Manu, can you please talk about the third battle of Panipat and Marathas in Haryana and Balochistan? There is a lot of unnecessary chest thumping in Maharashtra, especially after Neeraj Chopra's gold.
But they got hammered. The Marathas, right?
I did read something about this, but I'm not entirely sure about what this whole community of Marathas or whatever who moved and then sort of settled in Haryana and became a kind of local caste and all of that. I've got very basic knowledge on this. I'm not an expert on the Marathas, so I don't want to say something and then make a fool of myself.
No, but the third battle of Panipat, again, the result is clear. If the Marathas won that, yes, possibly we'll be speaking Marathi in Delhi and all that is fine. About the people who stayed behind and, adopted surnames from there or the names can be traced to Maharashtra, that's also fine. That happens all the time. But the battle was lost. Ahmad Shah Abdali triumphed and that's the story. The problem is that they want to act like, they've made movies about it and all. They sort of go for a grey area always, but there was no grey area. The battle was won.
Yeah. It was. And it's a tragedy that in India, when we make movies on these historical subjects, it's a bit over the top. It's sort of completely, again, it turns human beings into caricatures. It turns them into these sort of, chaste language spouting, always noble thoughts thinking characters. Whereas they were real people who were doing real political things. It had a lot of
and both sides are killers.
Crime. It had a lot of...
there's no really virtuous sort of behavior there. At the end of the day, you're killing fellow man over a piece of land. That's all it boils down to. But that's
the thing, right? The world was a very violent place till 100 years ago. Even the British, so much for them coming to civilize India. One of their favorite ways of executing Indians who were treasonous or seditious or whatever was to tie them to the mouth of a cannon and basically blow them out. And the thing is, your body would explode essentially, and your flesh would sort of land in chunks all over the countryside. And it was a means, and they called it a very humane form of execution because the person didn't live long enough to know what was happening to him. It was instant death. But for the people watching, it was so horrifying that it would send a message through the community not to stand up to the British. And this was the people civilizing India. So,
There you go. It was brutal and humane. What a paradox. And above everything else, it was not cost efficient. See, Indians would never do this. We would always be cost efficient. One cannonball for one human life, that's stupid. Honestly, they could just put him inside the cannon and shut it. No money, no cost to company. Wait 45 minutes to open it.
But the thing is, you also want to demonstrate. You want people to see the kind of power you have. There was this gentleman in Kerala who was very powerful in the early 19th century, and he executed a person by basically tying one leg to one elephant, another to another elephant, and then the elephants are driven in opposite directions. That is a slow death because elephants don't walk very fast. So you're basically being ripped apart rather slowly. The world was extremely violent.
So this was done with the Mongols and all, with the horses and stuff, right? But you take the 4 limbs and just...
because power was very fragile in those days. If you had power, you had to be really brutal in sort of holding on to it. And brutality was a way to sort of secure your power. Now we have democratic institutions. Now we use our tongue and sort of debate rather than actually slaughter each other in the street. And that's how power is transferred, through votes and ballot boxes. But till about 150 years ago, well, no, not entirely, but I mean, in great measure, the world for the first time is relatively...
Let's be positive. You're right. As Amit, our proprietor, or rather ex-proprietor, says, this is the best times actually in civilization, in spite of all the internecine wars you see here and there. Is that right to say? 21st century.
Overall, yes. More people are surviving into adulthood. People are living longer. People are dying of diabetes rather than...
And the conflict casualties are less actually than they would be if you compare to World War I, World War II, or even Korea, Vietnam, those kind of things.
Yeah. And even the nature of warfare is changing, right? Like traditional wars are not how war is even waged anymore. Like the US and Afghanistan is an example. Now it's terrorism. It's these localized, highly sort of surgical kind of things that are happening. And that's probably going to keep happening. Large deployments of armies are going to be a very rare thing. And it's going to be...
It's a bit unfair. One side has drones and they press buttons from, say, Washington or wherever. And the other side has like rifles and they're looking into the sky. And I mean, it's just unfair. People can't be 500 years behind the other people, because that's just not technology can't play such a big hand as it did in the conquest of India as well. Okay, let's get a couple more in.
Yes, sure. The next one comes in from Kumar. He says this about Manu. He says, my favorite historian. This man single-handedly made me fall in love with history. 2 questions to you both.
That's a huge tribute, Manu S. Pillai.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've never heard anyone say that about me. But then what would I make them fall in love with except hate?
He says, 2 questions to both of you. What are your favorite historic moments? And second, which historic moment was most impactful?
I don't have moments. Again, I'm more interested in the characters in history, because for me, they're just such well-formed human beings and so eccentric at times, so funny at times, that it's the human beings that really matter to me rather than moments or individual things that they achieved. Like, Malik Ambar, the African man who fought the Mughals in the Deccan for 25 years, begins life in Ethiopia in the Oromo tribe as a random kid, gets kidnapped and is sold into slavery in Baghdad, gets shipped to India where another black man who's the minister of the Sultan of Ahmednagar buys him. Then a few years later, he's freed, becomes a local warlord, has just a few hundred people, sort of cavalrymen with him. The Mughal invasion of the Deccan in the 1590s creates a political vacuum which he starts filling. Marathas start banding. Suddenly he has 7,000 soldiers, 20,000 soldiers. Shivaji's grandfather is among his comrades. And he becomes a kingmaker, gets his daughter. This chap from Ethiopia, Oromo tribe, ends up here. His daughter marries the Sultan. He becomes the kingmaker. And for 25 years, he's standing there. Ultimately, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir is reduced to sort of sitting in Agra and calling him names like this disastrous man, this black-faced man, because he refuses to be defeated. And Jahangir commissions a painting in which he shows himself shooting an arrow at Malik Ambar's impaled head, which was something Jahangir never actually achieved in life. It was just an imagination or a wishful painting that Jahangir wanted to see, because in real life, Malik Ambar died secure in a fortress, a very rich and confident man in the 1620s. People like that tell you how much history has... how fascinating it is. Marathas joining an African Muslim fighting for the Deccan, and this man wasn't even born in India, and he's fighting for the Deccan against the Mughals. It tells you how complex and rich history is, and that's why I said if you focus on the characters, you start seeing their worlds more with greater sort of ease. And when you see their worlds, you realize just how amazing history can be.
So you could say Malik Ambar lived the American dream for that time. He comes from nowhere. He's an immigrant. He doesn't speak the language. Next thing, he's top of the tree, and the biggest force in the land can't quell him, no matter how they try.
And even when I say he came as a slave, these were not slaves as in the American sense. They were military men. They were trained to come here and fight. They were not slaves in the sense that we use the term in more recent history.
So what you're saying is this is a caste system in slavery, or you could be like the Kshatriya slave.
Yeah, because the thing is, these men, the local Rajas, often they didn't trust their own courtiers and they didn't trust their own generals. So they needed men who would be loyal just to the king. So African slaves who were brought here as military men with no contact with their home countries, nowhere to go, and nothing other than the king's support to fall back on, would be loyal to the throne. That was the idea.
Game of chess. Brutal again. Yeah. For me, I think, honestly, I don't know about you, Sylvie, but there's so many moments in history one would like to be that fly on the wall who can listen and hear and see what really happened. Like we mentioned so many times, I'd love to know when he, after crossing, the Jhelum, the actual battle, did it really happen? And does it really end in Alexander's favor? Who is this Puru guy who's never heard of after or before? That kind of thing. I would love to know what happened. well, we discussed this before as well, after the Battle of Kalinga. This ridiculous story where he's just, suddenly changes his mind and says, okay, I'm full of piety and kindness and love, milk of human kindness, and I'm, changing everything.
Yeah, but that's, I think, being debunked now, because I think evidence suggests he was already a Buddhist when that happened.
Yeah, but one would love to just see how that thing transpires, how political it is, how Machiavellian the thinking is, etc., etc. And then, of course, I would love to know what happened at the end of Hitler. What really happens, and how does he destroy poor Blondie, the German Shepherd, and Eva Braun, and then himself, and his left arm had Parkinson's proper, where it was shaking completely if you study that at that point. So he has to shoot himself with only one functioning hand, etc. But would have been easy. So there's so many stories. Napoleon's death is always, odd. Yeah. And my namesake, who's perhaps the most benevolent of all kings, I would have liked to see what was really going on in that court as well.
Oh, Cyrus Sahukar. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, Cyrus Sahukar. Cyrus Sahukar, who doesn't know anything about Persian history. What a break to be born in Delhi. It's so sad for him. Yeah. All right. Should we take one more?
Yes, please. The next one comes from Uday Surya Narayanan. He says, I've read South Indian historical icons like Velu Thampi and Rani Abbakka in Amar Chitra Katha comics and not in textbooks. Should Amar Chitra Katha be introduced in schools, at least in early classes? What do you think?
No, I mean, so long as you've been exposed to the story and it whets curiosity, it doesn't matter where it comes from. But you're right. I think there is too much of a focus on North India, which is true in Indian history. Not enough of a focus on some of these other subjects and other characters and other areas. But I wouldn't go so far. For example, right now on Twitter, I've been seeing people saying, oh, why do we study so much about the Mughals and not about Vijayanagara? Part of it is just practical. The reason being that the Mughals were there till 1858. So the kind of material and documentation available is very rich. That's why, whole decades have passed and people have still not fully exhausted studying the Mughals. Vijayanagara was gone by the 17th century. The material you have is more slender. As a result of which, you don't know enough about that empire. And it's more difficult to construct as detailed and as complicated an account as the Mughals. So some of that is also practical issues like that. But yeah, I do hope that, in school textbooks, or at least through school teachers, even if textbooks don't have it, teachers should read more widely and sort of be able to make history a little more.
Manu, what is wrong with comics? As when you're very young, I'm not saying that you're studying in Oxford, Cambridge, and they're giving Amar Chitra Katha, but to whet your appetite, as that boy who mentioned that, he's transformed into a history buff because of you. What is wrong in using, colored imagery, easy language, dramatized in that sense in the comic, just introduce you to whoever the characters are, and then the kid, as he grows older, says, okay, I'm interested in this, and then he'll read for himself. So
nothing at all. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. That's why I said, so long as your exposure comes and it whets your appetite, I have no issue with where it comes from. I'm not one of those orthodox people who says it has to be like this very high-end book or whatever. It can come from multiple ways. My interest in history came from my grandmother telling me family gossip, because I was just fascinated that she could be so transparent about her parents, her uncles, her aunts, her grandparents, and see them not as these, figures as grandmother, grandfather, but as humans. And it was so stunning, and I've been able to talk to her about fairly, like, let's say, controversial things that people don't talk about in Indian families. I remember asking her that she told me that in the household in which she grew up, it was one of those old country agrarian households, an establishment with lots of people, but strangely, not too many people had bedrooms to themselves. People used to sleep all over the place. All the children would be in one room. The mother would be with them. The father alone would be sort of on this big canopy bed in one of the rooms or whatever. And I remember asking her with great curiosity, saying, your parents produced 8 children. How did that even happen if your mother's here and you've never seen your mother and father together during the day? They're never together. And then she said, and then she thought about it and she said, that's true. I've never really thought about it. But now that I think of it, every now and then at night, I would wake up cold because my mother wouldn't be next to me. So I'm guessing that's when, they would meet or whatever. But to me, it's interesting, in an agrarian joint family, how did people have intercourse? It's a question that matters because you make sense of that world by asking these small questions, by asking, what is, I remember going to the palace in Trivandrum when I was doing my first book. And on the first floor, there were these doors that opened out into thin air. If you walked out of that door, you'd fall down and die. And I kept thinking, why do they have doors like this on the first floor, not opening into a balcony, but just opening into the void? And it turned out that it was because lower caste people had to come in and clean the palace toilets and basically drain it. And obviously they were not going to be taken in from inside, from the main entrance. So they would put a ladder, open this door and enter the bathrooms directly and then clean it. Small details like that can give you so much texture, can give you so much insight into exactly how a palace operated. And the casteism that exists in that one door opening into thin air is a representative of the caste system. So asking these small questions can sometimes, matter. And not all stories are in books.
Let me ask you a small question, Manu. If you were a king in those times, would you keep a big harem?
Well, I mean, harems were often. By the way, harems have been stereotyped into this whole idea that the kings were just sleeping with all the women there. Some women were taken in for protection. Widows, older women, etc. Some were there, and they were often treated very well and with immense respect. Some of the women you wouldn't like dare stand sit in their presence. You'd be extremely respectful. The dowagers of older kings, etc., had tremendous influence. Only a small section would be your associates and your concubines and so on. And by no stretch are these British ideas that people had 3,000 wives and 500 concubines
what?
and all that.
Akbar had 903 concubines?
No.
It's not true. He's my favorite.
No.
How can he be my favorite if it's less? Don't lessen the number. You're breaking my heart.
He may have had a few hundred people in his harem, but that doesn't mean he's sleeping with all of them. Each of them occupies different positions. His grandfather's sisters, his great aunts, his mother's entourage.
Oh God, they better wear name tags, man. Guy drinks too much. He enters the harem. He's like, God, you got to know who your relatives are. Oh my God, this is horrible. I got a new book for you. Enter the harem.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Wait, can we do one last question?
Yeah.
Rohit Sharma has asked, after working with Shashi Tharoor, does Manu have political ambitions of his own?
Very good point.
I mean, the thing is, I don't have a famous last name. I don't have
Come on, Manu. That era is over. That era is gone.
No. I don't think I see myself, at least not anytime soon. Right now, I've got my work cut out for me. Writing, research, history. That's what I'm doing. And, who knows what the future holds, but no plans or anything.
But our politics is the history of the future. You have a choice. You can now become part of it.
We'll cross that bridge when we get there, if we ever get there.
So you're not saying completely no?
I'm not saying no, because I worked in politics, so I know a little bit about it and I am interested. But I can't opt for any traditional route for politics because it's not possible. In India, you need to have either cash, and I mean cash.
You get to the Rajya Sabha. As an eminent writer, we get you in those 12 seats in the Rajya Sabha for eminence. You get in.
If you have such influence, Cyrus, please do.
They have a very good canteen. You don't have to worry about policy.
I've eaten at the parliament.
What am I saying? You tell me.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I think it's been a great session. Thank you so much, Manu.
Thank you.
The book is called where is it?
False Allies.
False Alliance. False Alliance.
Allies, not alliance.
False Allies, not alliances. I'm sorry, I'm 50 years old and I can't find the damn paper which I kept from. Here it is. But all it says is washing hands for some reason. Yeah. False allies. Were the British or the royalty of India more cunning? To find out more, you have to read the book and see that it was a lot of this is based on sex and morality as well. So it'll be very interesting read, even if you're not a history buff. Yeah, I think sex sells. You have to do that. You have to do that from time to time. Okay. All right, guys. Have a good day. I'm off to take photographs with Amit Doshi for this podcast.
All right.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye. Bye.
See you. Okay, catch us on any of the podcasting apps, please. We beg you. We need you. Send us your questions on Twitter on Cyrus Says In. Or you can email us, even if you're not female, on whatcyrussays@gmail.com.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Dugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders and change makers from across business, media, marketing and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app or wherever you get your podcast from.
From uncensored and unfiltered chats with the who's who of the entertainment industry, I, Siddharth Kannan, bring you a very hardcore chat show called Candid Kannan. Tune in every Friday on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.